Hello YouTube, Cyber Aquarist here, bringing you part 2 of my series Nitrates in the Aquarium. And in part 1 I conducted 2 nitrate tests on my 150 gallon aquarium using API's nitrate test kit and CChem's nitrate test kit. API's test reads in parts per million and CChem's in milligrams per liter. A note about parts per million and milligrams per liter: they mean exactly the same thing when dealing with the concentrations you'll be facing in the aquarium. 1 part per million equals 0.998859 milligrams per liter. To see how insignificant this variation is, take for example 1,000 parts per million, and at 1,000 parts per million you will have 998.8 milligrams per liter. That's a difference of 1.2. You would need a low-range nitrate test kit to detect that small variation of 1.2. So for all purposes, milligrams per liter, parts per million mean exactly the same thing. But for the purpose of this video, just to keep it simple, from now on in this series, when I refer to nitrate concentrations, I'm going to say parts per million or ppm. Alright, we also talked about nitrate shock, nitrate poisoning in the aquarium environment, and we're going to move on to nitrate shock. But nitrate poisoning, if you don't believe it's real, just don't do a water change for a few months and see what happens to the health of your fish. Nitrate shock isn't as commonly understood or even known about as nitrate poisoning, but nitrate shock is more frequent than nitrate poisoning. And nitrate shock is when you take a fish from a really low concentration of nitrates and expose it to a very high concentration of nitrates, or taking a fish from a very high concentration of nitrates and subjecting it to a very low concentration of nitrates. A lot of the sensitive species, they can die with a fluctuation as low as 10 parts per million, either way, going from high to low or low to high. But more of the resilient fish like African cichlids, Central and South Americans, they can withstand fluctuations of 40 parts per million and be fine. I don't recommend doing that, but just to let you know, nitrate shock is real. Take for example, you've got a brand new aquarium, you set it up, did a fishless cycle or a fish-in cycle, and your aquarium is cycled, your ammonia is 0 parts per million, nitrates 0 parts per million, and you're just starting to detect the first signs of nitrates. Let's say you have 2 milligrams per liter. The reason I'm saying milligrams per liter is because most test kits read in milligrams per liter when you get below 5. So let's say you have 2, and it's very, very low nitrates. You go to your local fish store, pick out some sensitive species for your aquarium, bring them home, you introduce them to your aquarium, and the next morning you wake up and several of your rummy-nosed tetras are dead, if not all of them, and you can't figure out what's going on. You call the local fish store and you say, hey, my pH is 7.0. What's the pH of your aquarium there that I bought these rummy-nosed tetras out of? The fish store employee tells you, well, ours is 7.0 or 6.8. Okay, well, that's probably not the cause of death. Your ammonia is 0, your nitrates test is 0, your water temperature is fine. What could be going on? Well, it's not a secret that local fish stores pack their aquariums full of fish, and they may do a 50% water change once a week, which most local fish stores will do that. But like I said in my last video, if you're only doing a 50% water change every week, your nitrate concentrations will never go below the rate of production. And in a local fish store's setup, even if it's a centralized system, it's not uncommon to see nitrate concentrations as high as 50 to 60 parts per million, even after a 50% water change. They could be 30 to 40 parts per million. It depends on what the weekly rate of production is. And so let's say that you went there, you bought these rummy-nosed tetras out of this aquarium that had a nitrate concentration of 40 parts per million. You bring it home, put it in your aquarium that only has 2 milligrams per liter. Well, you're subjecting that Romeo's tetra to a fluctuation of 38 parts per million of nitrates in a short period of time. That fish just isn't going to make it. More of the hardier species will, but we're talking about nitrate shock here. It is real. It happens more so with more sensitive species, and you can go to the other extreme. Let's say that you take a fish out of an aquarium that has 5 parts per million nitrates, and then you give it to your buddy who has old tank syndrome, where his nitrate concentrations are 80 parts per million. He has the fish a couple days and it dies. Well, and you'll chalk it up to stress. Well, it is stress, but it's caused from nitrate shock. A lot of these fish that you bring home from the local fish store, and you think, well, it was an internal parasite that killed it, or some other freak of nature, something happened. But chances are it's nitrate shock. And my advice to you to help avoid nitrate shock is everybody asks what the pH of the water is at your local fish store. Some people might ask what the general hardness and carbonate hardness are, but ask them what their nitrate concentration is. If you're going to be spending money there, they owe it to you to perform a test and to show you what their levels are. If they're very high and your levels are very low, drip acclimate these fish for several hours. I mean, you want to be safe to minimize the stress caused on these fish. So that's my advice to you when bringing home sensitive species like that. I just mentioned old tank syndrome. And what old tank syndrome is this a condition where nitrates have accumulated in the aquarium very slowly over long periods of time, to the point where introducing new species is almost impossible because they'll die of nitrate shock. And the fish that have adjusted to these changes in the aquarium have only been the most hardy species, and even then their growth is stunted, reproduction is almost impossible, and ultimately they'll die. So now we're going to move on to talking about water changes. Water changes are the oldest method and the most tried and true way to lower nitrate concentrations in the aquarium. But before we get into water changes, I want to talk about weekly rate of production and a baseline. Your weekly rate of production is easy to determine. It's not rocket science. Just do a nitrate test immediately following a water change. It doesn't have to be after a water change, but this is a good time to do it. Just ensure that when you test for your nitrates on that day, wait exactly 7 days at the same time. So if you test your nitrate Saturday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, be sure that you do not conduct any water changes between the first Saturday at 1 o'clock to the very next Saturday at 1 o'clock. Same time, no water changes in between. The difference between the reading of your second measurement, let's say you started with 5 parts per million Saturday at 1 o'clock. The following Saturday at 1 o'clock, you test and your concentration is 10 parts per million. Like I said, it's not rocket science. You have a weekly rate of production of 5 parts per million. So this is going to help us to determine what your water changes need to be, what type of schedule you need to be on, and also it's going to determine your baseline. When we start talking about nitrate removing media or methods, you'll need to know what this weekly rate of production was, because it'll be your baseline to determine whether or not your nitrate removing method is working or not. And I know your weekly rate of production will change as time goes on and your fish grow larger. You're adding more food to the aquarium to compensate for the larger fish. The larger fish produce more waste than they did when they were smaller. So it's a good idea to test your weekly rate of production about every month and a half. When you have fast growing fish like Oscars or Jack Dempsey's or Dove cichlids, you might want to test more frequently, say once a month. But to determine what your water changes need to be, know what you're dealing with. Know what your concentrations are going to build up to in a weekly period. I've outlined a few scenarios based on some suggestions of performing a 20% water change once a month or a 20% water change weekly. And I know back in the day, everybody said only do a 20% water change once a month or you'll kill your fish. Well, that's not true. It could be true if your concentrations of nitrates are 60 parts per million and you perform more than a 20% water change, you're going to subject your fish to nitrate shock. But if you keep up with your water changes from day one, you're not going to experience old tank syndrome or nitrate shock. But I modeled a monthly water change of 20% at a weekly rate of production of 5 parts per million. This is a very small bioload. So let's look at week 1 after the tank is cycled. Now mind you, all these models that I've put together don't start until after your aquarium is cycled and you have 0 ammonia, 0 nitrite, and then as soon as you start detecting nitrate, that's when this scenario occurs. So week 1, you have a weekly rate of production of 5 parts per million. At the end of that week, you're going to have 5 parts per million. Week 2, it's going to go from 5 to 10. Week 3, from 10 to 15. And then on the 4th week, it's going to go from 15 to 20, and then you do your 20% water change. You're going to remove 4 parts per million. You're not dealing with nitrate shock there, it's safe, but your concentrations will then be at 16 parts per million at the end of week 4. It only goes up from there. I'm not going to read these chronologically. I'm just going to give you some examples. After 1 month, it was 16 parts per million after your water change. 2 months, at the end of 2 months, it's going to be 28.8 parts per million concentration in your aquarium. At the end of 3 months, 39.04 parts per million. At the end of 4 months, now we're starting to deal with nitrate shock too. At the end of 4 months, your 20% water change going from 62.23 parts per million down to 53.78 parts per million, you're subjecting your fish to a 13.45 parts per million fluctuation. Some of the more sensitive species can start dying at this point. After 6 months, guys, if you're doing a monthly 20% water change, at the end of 6 months on week 24, your nitrate concentrations will be 59.02 parts per million. So right away, right there, common sense tells you 20% water change, even on a small bioload, it's not the answer. All right, let's look at the same aquarium where we're doing a 20% weekly water change. 20% weekly. All right, 5 parts per million being produced every week. At the end of week 1, you have 5 parts per million. You do a 20% water change. You're removing 1 part per million, you're left with 4. 5 more on top of that, you have 9 parts per million. Do a 20% water change, 1.8 drop down to 7.2. Well, as time goes on, at the end of 1 month, you're up to 9.76 parts per million concentration. At the end of 2 months, you're up to 15.79% concentration. 3 months, 18.29. 4 months, 19.32. At the end of 6 months, you're up to 20 parts per million concentration. And your water changes still aren't subjecting you to nitrate shock, but this is only after 6 months. I don't know about you guys, but I like to keep my aquariums set up for a long time. I've had aquariums set up for as long as 8 years. If it's up to 20 parts per million at the end of 6 months, what do you think it's going to be at the end of 2 years? 20% weekly is not going to be enough either. A better scenario that I've outlined, the same aquarium with a weekly rate of production of 5 parts per million. Let's say at the end of week 1, you do a 20% water change. Okay, you remove 1 part per million, you're left with 4. The second week, do a 50% water change. You're going to remove half of the nitrates in the aquarium, leaving you with 4.5 parts per million of nitrates. everything's great. It's gone back down. The third week, do another 20% water change. The fourth week, do a 50% water change. You don't have to do a 50% water change every week on your aquarium if it has a low weekly rate of production. And plus you want to keep in mind the species that you're keeping here. If you're keeping sensitive species, keep the water change fluctuations low. You don't want your fish to be subject to more than 10 parts per million nitrate removal or fluctuation at any given time. So throwing in a 20% water change once a week is very good. You're replacing minerals that have been lost. You're removing nitrates. But guys, throw in a 50% water change every other week. At the end of 10 weeks, if you're doing 50% bi-weekly water changes with an occasional 20% water change between the 50%, you're looking at a final concentration of 8.71 parts per million, and at water change time, you're only talking about 4.35 fluctuation. So that's good. You see that consistency is the key. Don't go 1 month performing only a 20% water change. And I want to debunk a couple of myths about water changes right here while we're talking about them. I know people would say not to vacuum more than half of your substrate at any one given time. Well, that philosophy carries over from old school when everybody was using an undergravel filter. It's not the case today. If you're using an external canister filter, a hang-on-the-back power filter, or a sump with with beneficial bacteria growing on a media such as biochem stars, bioballs, matrix, any type of biological media that you choose, that is going to be your main source of bacteria colonization. You will have bacteria that grow in the aquarium. They'll even grow on the glass. You're going to be cleaning your glass. It's kind of stupid to say not to clean your glass because you're removing beneficial bacteria. Well, if you start off from your first water change, siphoning your gravel bed, removing detritus that accumulates, any waste that accumulates, that's far more beneficial than only changing half of your or vacuuming half of your substrate with each water change. Your bacteria will continue to reproduce in the media that you have for your aquarium as long as you have enough media to support that bioload, or that amount of fish in your aquarium, if you will. So that is not true. Only change, vacuum half of your gravel at any given time. Also, the myth that if you change 50% of your water today and then do a 50% water change the next day, will change out 100% of your aquarium's volume of water. That's not true. Think about it logically. Say you have 10 parts per million, you do a 50% water change, you have 5 parts per million. The very next day, you do a 50% water change. Is that 5 parts per million going to go down to 0? No. It's going to go to 2.5 parts per million. So you see, you're not doing a 100% water change unless you're doing a 100% water change. The numbers keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, each day that goes by. But the ammonia, nitrite, and nitrates are constantly being released into the aquarium, being removed by your media. But it's perfectly fine to do a 50% water change. You're not going to kill the bacteria in your external filter. Just don't do a water change and then immediately take your filter and clean it. I suggest always clean your media in tank water. Just get you a bucket of water and take your media that comes out of your canister filter or your bio oil on your hang on the back or whatever, submerge it in the bucket of tank water, shake it out, put it back up there. Don't rinse it under chlorinated tap water. If you've got a basket from a canister filter, just take the handle, shake it up and down, and the water flowing through it will remove any debris. Got a phone call, but they'll just have to wait. Okay, so that's another myth. You know, 50% water change back to back will change out 100% of your water. Okay, well, this video has gone on long enough. We'll move on to another video where we're going to start looking at different types of nitrate removing methods and media. You know, we'll get into the media. But guys, as this series progresses, any questions that you may have, just send me a personal message or in the comments below. Just give me your thoughts, what you're thinking of, any questions that you have, something that you'd like me to cover, and we'll go over it. There's so many suggestions, you know, that people have, and you know, we'll discuss them. We'll see if, you know, if it holds up to logic or not. But guys, thanks for watching part 2. I know I kind of stumbled a little bit. I had a lot to cover. I'll have part 3 up just as soon as possible. You guys take care. Have a good one.